screen. I'm Aotearoa Senior Fellow at Motu. John McDermott, Executive Director, is unfortunately ill, so he can't do it. And we also have another, of course, substitute. But in the case of the Productivity Commission, they're trading up rather than trading down. So that's all right. Let me just make it clear, masks are optional here because it's a private event. Apparently, that's the rules. So if you wish to wear a mask, fine. If you don't, it's fine. In terms of admin, toilets are at the top of the stairs, just along the hallway. Now, before I introduce our speakers and the topic, I just want to thank our sponsors. These public policy seminars take a lot of work to run, and higher premises, etc. So I want to thank our sponsors for the public policy seminars, the Productivity Commission, Treasury, StatsNZ, and EGA. So thanks for the 4 sponsors. Right, well, today we're looking at these documents: Immigration by Numbers and Immigration for the Future, reports from the Productivity Commission. We will structure it as follows. First of all, we'll have 2 speakers from the Productivity Commission, Philip Stevens and Ganesh Nana. And then we'll have a short panel discussion with presentations from Richard Bedford, Rachel Simpson, and myself. And I'll introduce each of those 2 when we get there. And so the 3 of us will have 5 minutes each, and we'll throw it open for questions to the entire panel, including Ganesh and Philip. So first of all, let me introduce our first 2 speakers from the Productivity Commission. Philip Stevens is Director of Economics and Research at the Productivity Commission. He's got 20 or so years experience in economic and social research. He's worked in universities, independently, and in the public sector. And jobs here included MED, MB, Ministry of Education, etc., before he came to the Productivity Commission. And I won't mention his previous background as a guitarist as well. And Ganesh Nana, we all know Ganesh. Ganesh is chair now of the Productivity Commission. For many years, he ran BURL, the business consultancy, economics consultancy, and he's done a lot of work with that BURL and after different areas, including building relationships with Maori entities and organisations and understanding the Maori economy. And Ganesh became chair of the Productivity Commission last year, I guess it was. Yeah. So we'll start off with Philip. Both Philip and Ganesh will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have the panelists. Over to you, Philip.
Okay, so tēnā koutou, whātau. Ko Motu Māma, ko Simpson Aotearoa New Zealand, te iwi, ko Simpson te hapu, ko NZ tuatai te waka, ko haina o waka te marae. So I say that both because it's a way to start speeches in New Zealand, but also as a potential conflict of interest. I'm from England, I am a migrant, so I am also subject to these policies that we're going to talk about here. So just to get it on the table first, while I'm also a citizen. So what we're going to talk about today is, some of you may be aware that we had a migration inquiry. The government asked us to investigate immigration settlements for long-term prosperity and well-being of New Zealanders. So this covers a system-wide view, not just focusing on specific sectors, and the focus is on working age, economic migration, as opposed to refugees, tourism, etc. So that's the kind of scope. And we've been asked to think about prosperity and well-being more broadly, and in doing that, we're taking in a lot of the kind of view, sort of on-net views like the 4 capitals approach. There's a bit of excuse in their ways of thinking, and also the distribution, and of course the treaty impact as well. So, and as we just said, 2 papers, that's what they look like. So part 1, that's me. So we take a long view. So I won't take you back to sort of the risks of Kenya, but certainly New Zealand, to say New Zealand as a country of migrants is kind of stating it obvious. First migration took place, New Zealand being one of the last large places to be inhabited back in the 12th century. Last one really being Antarctica, although here plastic has arrived there already, so that's it. So More recently, productivity when the data gets better, as it were. We can think of Tuturiti Waitangi as being the first migration document or policy, as it were. So as you can see, around the time of the signing of the treaty, the Maori population was about 100,000 people, and they were quickly overtaken by a whole lot of Manahiri. So most of those being from Europe and indeed the British Isles. And this, of course, has gradually changed over since the 1990s. Quite a change there. Right, so I've got a whole lot of numbers in here. There's 90 or so in the 90 or so graphs in the thing, and I tried to reduce that down, so I'll try and be quick. So basically, here's some of the bigger kind of context. So mostly, apart from that very early period, population growth is driven by natural increase, net births and deaths. Except in recent years, we've seen both a slowdown in births, but also a large increase in migration. So for one of the first sort of times, the actual contribution of migration has actually outweighed the contribution of net births and deaths. Now, these you can see the migration part of this shoots up and down quite a lot, and it's generally related to kind of economic conditions. So we can see how migration has been low, and it was indeed negative in some of these periods, like the Long Depression in the 1880s, the Great Depression in the 1930s, the wool shock in the 70s, oil shock in the 70s and 80s, and an outflow of people during the economic restructuring in the late 80s, etc. So, and then inflow again until the Asian financial crisis. And in more recent years, we've had the Australian mining boom, where there was again net immigration from New Zealand. So, and then in the most recent years, as you can see, net migration soared to levels which has been pretty much not seen before. Okay, before we kind of go on, it's probably worth just pointing out that net migration, which is often what we talk about, is the product of two very big numbers here. There's a lot of inflow and a lot of outflow. So people flow in both directions, yeah. So if we're talking about stopping immigration or whatever, we're not just talking about that net flow, we're talking about those big flows in both directions. And both of those increased a great deal since the Second World War. So it's not just one or the other, they're both increased. So those two I'm going to say, I can't describe the colours on here because it's different to what we're seeing on there, but the orange stroke blue one at the top being the arrivals and the one below being the departures and migration being on the average. So both of those have increased. They increased pretty much in the 50s, but the immigration increased during the 50s and the emigration started picking up a bit later. So the large shift in net migration are often driven by one or the other, spikes in one of the other two, interesting enough. So peaks and troughs in the 60s, the early 70s, driven mainly by spikes and arrivals, whereas those in the 80s driven by peaks and departures. And so they're actually kind of tended to be negatively correlated until some more recent years. So more facts. So New Zealand has a very large diaspora compared to a lot of other countries, particularly OECD countries. And the ones that have kind of countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, etc., Portugal, which are poor countries on the edge of a large trading bloc with free movement of labour, which economists wouldn't be surprised to see large amounts of labour going there. And we have a large diaspora, and they tend to go to English-speaking, richer countries. One of which you might be aware of is quite close at hand. As New Zealand and Australia tended to tag alongside each other in this is GDP, not income, so it's not a welfare measure. As they started separating apart, this is also when the stock of migrants, so the black line in the bottom graph there is the New Zealand-born people in Australia, and the blue line is Australian-born in New Zealand. And we can see as the economies diverged, the people diverged, and the people that move are usually more highly qualified. The ones that go to Australia, actually not. They're actually slightly less qualified than the average New Zealander. I could quote Motu, possibly the other way shan't. Right, so where's this kind of growth from? Well, one other unusual thing about New Zealand is that we have a high degree of temporary migration in our country, and this is also increasing. So they play a much more important role than all of these other countries that we list there. And the stock of temporary work visas has pretty much doubled since like 2009 to 2020, and driven by essential skills, study to work, and work to resident visas. So that's something that's relatively new to New Zealand. We'll talk. So clearly, economic migration is about demand and supply. And so what's interesting is to see is over the period where we have data, the correlation between net immigration and labour shortages here is relatively high, except in that period between 2000 and 2007-ish, which is that period when basically a whole lot of migrants went to Australia. But apart from that period, the two are kind of related, which is again what you'd kind of expect to see. Another high degree of correlation is between the economic activity more broadly and migration. So obviously the economy requires more people when it's expanding. We already know we have very high labour participation in this country. A lot of our growth has come from labour participation. So we've had relatively low unemployment and high economic activity. So the dotted line at the top is economic inactivity, and that's been low and dropping, and the unemployment rate in the dotted line there. So over this period of low inactivity and relatively low unemployment, the two lines of annual job creation, which is the slightly orangey colour for you and blue for me, and the blue dotted line for you, which is orange for me, is the net migration rate. The two go very closely together, apart from 1 year, which is 2009, where something else happened, and a lot of Kiwis need to come home, and there wasn't a great deal of job creation going on in that year. Okay, so who are they? Oh my goodness me! So that's okay. We don't. The colour of your skin, we are. We don't mind about so much. So the kind of main contribution that migrants make to our economy is kind of what they bring to their workplaces. Yeah, so gains arise from workers moving to where they can create most value, and firms bringing in workers that they find most useful. So our overseas born adults that we have in our working population, they're more likely to have a degree than New Zealand born people in our population, and they're also less likely to have no qualifications at all. If you look at the OECD study of adult skills, we find that our overseas workers are actually some of the most literate in the OECD, which is kind of quite interesting. They tend to have slightly lower English literacy skills relative to New Zealand, or indeed any of the other two national languages, but they do have very high of their own literacy levels. So, but generally speaking, we seem to do quite well on average. Okay, and although that may have changed over time, as I say, since temporary migrants have increased. So where are they? Well, they're everywhere. Migrants are used all across the economy. This is quite a busy graph. And so basically what we've got on the horizontal axis is the percentage of migrant labour. So basically further to the right, you use more migrant labour, and upward is labour productivity, so a measure of the kind of performance. There are a couple of sectors like utilities that are actually right off the top of the graph because they're so capital intensive, and labour productivity is so huge. But generally speaking, we can see there's a group of low productivity industries that have a high share of migrants down at the bottom, but there's also several high productivity industries that also rely on migrant labour. And they also vary in the types of migrant they use. So basically, recent migrants on skilled residence visas are important for telecoms and professional scientific services, whereas migrant workers working in horticultural accommodation tend to be on non-skill related, non-resident schemes such as the RSE scheme. And this heterogeneity makes it difficult for us to say, here's the net effect. And so we need some kind of more fundamental analysis. So here's some words rather than pictures. So basically what we did, one of the pieces of work that we did is with Richard Failing and Dave Murray, and I looked at basically looking at the migrants as kind of inputs into a production of a firm. So basically we estimate production functions and wage bill equations in a way that's been used often to understand like gender discrimination and ethnic discrimination, but using it in a slightly different way by saying firms that employ, are migrants more or less productive? Are they paid more or less? Because we don't have good hours data in these data sets. So we want to make sure that they're not more productive because they're working more hours and therefore paying more in total as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff in there. The paper is coming out shortly, and we'll have some presentations on this paper, some other ones. But just to say that the things that we find that skilled and long-term migrants make contributions to output that exceed the top quartile of skilled New Zealand born workers, and this is likely to be a mix of the kind of skills that they have, but also kind of effort or whatever they're paid in wages. And migrants who are on non-skilled visas, they tend to be associated with lower output than your average New Zealander, and they look more like the kind of low-skilled, the bottom quartile of skills New Zealander. We also look at because the share of long-term migrants in New Zealand has increased over time, and you might think that over time people would learn skills and there be kind of matching reasons why they might become more productive. And we have shown that we find that their contribution to output appears to be increasing over this period. So there seems to be some positive returns to that. We've also got some tentative evidence about high-skilled New Zealand-born workers, those that work in firms with high migrant shares. There appears to be some sort of complementarities between the two, which is quite interesting. So basically, there's some benefit of them working alongside migrants. This could be due to flows of information. There's also could be due to positive sorting as well, but it seems more likely that story of them gaining some of those skills would be some spillovers there. So that was a very fast run over a whole lot of other stuff. There's two more charts to see, which is more thinking about impacts kind of stuff. So generally speaking, as I said at the beginning, we normally expect people moving to where they're valued most and people bringing people they value most to them would have kind of positive net benefits. That assumes that there's not fixed constraints elsewhere. So one of the things one of the worries that have been raised, and there's a series of charts in the chart in the document, but I'll just talk to one here, is that there might be some capital dilution. They're all coming in here. They're replacing capital and that sort of thing. Well, the capital stock has actually outpaced the total employment and the migrant population, generally speaking. That's certainly not prima facie evidence that this caused a massive capital dilution. We're a country that's always had low capital to labour ratio as it's been measured, so it doesn't appear to have made it worse, except possibly in the last few years, the very last 5 years or so. And we may not have seen capital having a chance to adapt to what is unprecedentedly fast adjustment. But prima facie, there doesn't appear to be a dropping off the cliff. So that's not the same as evidence that's saying it's not there. Evidence of evidence and evidence of absence aren't the same thing. But prima facie, there's something there that seems to be saying, generally speaking, our very low capital stock appears to be keeping up. So another thing we've been thinking about is like houses and stuff. Again, these people come here and they steal our homes because we've got a fixed number of houses and we fill them up or whatever. And again, we haven't had time to do some deep kind of analysis of this, but ultimately, from what we've found, generally speaking, New Zealand-born people and foreign-born people are about the same size. They fit in the same kind of houses. The issues about population and housing construction, not necessarily about migration. So it seems to be that the prices for migrants were shooting up. I said this before, the recent drops in housing prices, but generally speaking, that increase in housing prices were happening before the migrants had their recent really big growth. And of course, when we shut off migration pretty much by 100%, housing prices kept on going. Now they have started coming back down again, and maybe that's a lagged effect. I don't know. But again, I would argue that the evidence suggests that the issue is about population and the appropriate size of the housing market and how it returns to this. And if you look at recent work that the Infocom has done, they've done some really interesting work looking at the elasticities of the responsiveness of the housing stock to population growth. It seems that in earlier periods, the housing market seemed to respond relatively quickly to changes in either prices or population, which is kind of how you expect markets to work. In more recent years, that doesn't seem to be the case. So as an economist, I would look there first before necessarily sending people like me home. So that's the end of that one. I'll pass you now over here. I said 15 minutes. No one believed me, and it was 16 minutes, so you're all right.
Thanks, Philip. Tēnā katoa, ki te mihi o ki te kaupapa o tēnei hui. E ngā waitapu, ngā maunga whakahi, ngā wharepuni, me ngā wharewala no tēnei hui. Tēnā katoa. Ko Ganesh nana tōku ingoa. Chair of the Productivity Commission, and welcome you here and thank you for your time. I won't take up too much more on the introductions. Hopefully, my time will be sort of 15 minutes as well. Just to reiterate, or just to note that while we're talking about the two documents today, there is a whole lot of additional research and data and evidence and working papers that we'll send you to. That's available on our website. Some of them available now, some of them will be forthcoming. For today, it's my job just to talk to you about I suppose what we call the summary or the headline document, the Immigration Fit for the Future. It's the document that got tabled in Parliament, so that's our official, for want of a word, deliverable that we can tick off at the Productivity Commission. And there's lots more stuff behind it though. Just in terms of the headline findings, summary findings, call it what you like. In aggregate, immigration has a small and positive effect on productivity and wages in New Zealand. It's a bit of a mouthful to say, and we'll say openly that in aggregate is doing a bit of heavy lifting in that sentence, but that's a finding and that's backed up by evidence in the data. As economists, we're not only surprised at that finding, it's consistent with overseas studies and consistent with the theory. I suppose the second bullet point shouldn't be any surprise to this audience. It's a story that's been well told. The GDP growth or the economic growth we've experienced over the last few years has been just that. It has been economic growth. It hasn't been a story of productivity growth. The economic growth we have delivered and experienced has come from adding more people to the workforce, both New Zealanders and migrants, and getting them working longer hours than the OECD average, and definitely longer hours than countries that we like to compare ourselves with. And as I suppose, as is incumbent on me, in terms of the Productivity Commission, if we're serious about productivity, we've got to recognise that productivity is a long game. It requires investment. It requires investments not just in our physical infrastructure and that hard infrastructure and indeed the community infrastructure, but also the investment in our people. In contrast to productivity being a long game, our immigration settings and that relationship between immigration and productivity, we have a habit of looking at it from the short-term perspective. And it's that balance between the short and the long term, which is very much the theme of the document and in terms of our findings and recommendations. And I'll give you some examples about that short-term, long-term in a second. That last bullet point I put up just for the record, and we have to state it quite openly. For those who are looking for immigration as the solution to all of our ills and woes that we face, and in particular our productivity ills, you will be disappointed by this inquiry and by our findings. Immigration is not the solution to our productivity woes. For those who want to use migrants as the nasty evil and point to them as the cause of our problems, you will also be disappointed. As said, immigration is neither the cause nor the solution to our productivity problems. This is a picture that's a bit of a version of the one that Philip showed earlier, but a more simplified version of the one. Migrants make an important contribution to the economy. They more than offset the loss of skilled New Zealanders, so it's more than offset that brain drain that everybody talks about, and indeed has addressed some of the risks of labour shortages that some sectors face. And apart from the GFC, the chart shows that net migration, the inflows coming in, have moved in line with the jobs that are being created. So jobs are created, migrants come in, jobs are created. We can argue as economists about which comes first. That picture over there in the last 20 years, with the one exception around the GFC, indicates that they go together. That leads us to the finding that we find no evidence of systemic or systematic displacement of New Zealanders from jobs coming from migrants. On average, indeed, small positive effects on both wages and employment of New Zealand born over the last 20 years. So systematically, no evidence of that labour displacement, no evidence of migrants taking jobs from New Zealanders. We will say though, and we don't want to downplay it, but we will recognise that immigration can be negative for certain groups in the population, and indeed certain groups where those groups have low level skills or experience and an education, in particular youth and Māori and Pacifica. We don't want to underplay that. Those costs felt by those populations or those groups can be quite large and can be quite hurtful for individuals, whānau and communities in those areas. And in particular, those impacts can be scarring. Even so, having said that, those negative impacts are pockets of displacement that may be experienced, but they are not systematic over time or over those particular groups. Our response in terms of a policy response to where that displacement occurs is not to turn the taps off in terms of migration. Those displacement effects are actually not being caused by migration, they are being caused by the lack of opportunity or the lack of ability of those groups to take up the opportunities in the labour market. So the policy response should be focused on those groups to enable them, to empower them to take up those opportunities. So it's an education and training and active labour market policy perspective, not an immigration lever that needs to be tweaked. Oops, I've gone through too many times. No, see, I've lost my track. What have we got there? No evidence. No, that's right. Okay, I'll go back to that short-term, long-term, and that displacement impact in a second. But just carrying forward, yes, immigration has made a positive contribution to the New Zealand economy in terms of employment and jobs and wages. However, over the last few years, the system has become increasingly unbalanced. After the GFC, we introduced a few more visa categories and in particular shifted more towards temporary visa categories and temporary migrants, and that's shown through in this graph here or in this chart. New visa categories, in particular, for example, working holiday visas, promotion of temporary visa item categories. The unbalanced system has led to many temporary migrants having expectations of a pathway to residence. Whether those expectations were well formed or not is an argument, but those expectations did create that expectation of residency, a pathway to residency. That's created a lot of strife, not just for migrants, but also for New Zealanders in terms of our reputation abroad, in terms of the way we treat our migrants. And that's something that we need to address. If we bring in migrants, whether they be temporary or permanent, we need to be clear on their pathway towards residence, whether they have one or not. That needs to be clear before the migrants come in. And that's part of looking after migrants now, or looking after visitors. And indeed, part of that unbalanced system also came at the same time as we had less New Zealanders going offshore. That led to population growth and led to additional impacts and pressures on aspects of what we call absorptive capacity. Absorptive capacity, both physical and social and community, is our ability to not just settle migrants, but also to deliver services to New Zealanders and migrants, whether they be health or education services, or whether they be housing, or the roading and transport infrastructure, or indeed the labour force and the workforce opportunities that may or may not be available. Migration policy needs to consider absorptive capacity alongside a whole lot of other things. In the short run, and we do default to the short run, which is unfortunate, but in the short run, we have the story of migrants putting pressure on our absorptive capacity. But let's not forget, in the long run, migrants alongside New Zealanders give us the workforce to improve and increase our absorptive capacity, whether that's operating in the construction sector to build the houses, or whether it's doctors and nurses to enable us to provide even more and efficient health services. So migrants alongside New Zealanders can add to our absorptive capacity in the long run, as well as perhaps increasing demand on the capacity in the short run. And it's that balance between the short and the long run that we need to address, not just in migration policy, but in terms of all of our other investment policies. In terms of investment in absorptive capacity, as Philip indicated earlier, the Infrastructure Commission has indicated that we're not very good in responding to population pressures now in terms of our ability or our desire to invest in that absorptive capacity. And so that's the policy angle, rather than turning off the migration tap because of short-term effects on absorptive capacity. In terms of policy, sorry, I'm losing track. A couple of long-term wins that we recommend, but to shift that balance in not just our mindsets, but in terms of the policy towards looking at the longer term and gaining those longer term benefits, rather than some of the policy settings that we have that shift us more towards the knee-jerk short-term responses. In particular about labour market information and monitoring, we want to improve the information about labour shortages, not just for immigration purposes. We want to improve the information about labour shortages so that that will help us inform our decisions about training and our workforce development programs and active labour market policies and those efforts alongside decisions about immigration. And also, indeed, we want wage pressures to come through. If there are shortages in the labour market, if there are shortages for particular skills, we do want the wage pressures to show through to influence not just government, but indeed business decisions about allocation of labour and about taking up new technology, new modes of production to indeed improve their productivity. So we need to have a lot more information and indeed better and coordinated information for labour market monitoring, both skills shortages, vacancy indicators, and wage pressures, as well as moving away from ANSCO, those outdated classifications of occupation, towards something more in line with how we use skills. Lastly, just conscious of time, lastly, there's a couple of extra things to say. Just in terms of our big, I suppose, headline recommendation, and it may sound bureaucratic, but we make no apologies for it, but it's to embed in the system and the processes a mechanism that puts immigration policy settings within the context of our absorptive capacity decisions and our workforce development decisions, and also, to dare I say, tilt the playing field more towards those long-term considerations, because what we've experienced in the last 10 or so years in the immediate pre-COVID era, we have responded to skill shortages through the skill shortage list, which has not encouraged the long-term training that we might need to do. It's that make or buy decision that firms need to assess. For too long, I think we've gone towards the easy buy, make or buy, faced with a skill shortage. Do I make the skill here, or do I buy it in from abroad? Buying it in from abroad is the short-term decision. It's easy and relatively cheap, as opposed to the longer-term decision about making it here in terms of workforce, investing in our workforce development. We're not saying it's either or, it's a bit of both, but we just want to tilt that playing field more towards the make here rather than the trap we've fallen into in the past, which was the easy decision in terms of those temporary visas. So we want to bring that into a government policy statement alongside the long-term, short-term decisions about absorptive capacity, alongside what do we actually want immigration for, and also alongside bringing into treaty. That government policy statement is a mechanism to bring all of those decisions together, openly admit that different governments of different colours will fall differently between those decisions in terms of short-term and long-term trade-offs. That is their right. We just want those decisions and those trade-offs to be a lot more transparent than they currently are. And I think I'll leave that there. I've flipped over a lot of other things, but I'm sure a lot more will come up in the conversation. Kia ora.
I invite all other four, plus myself, will come and sit up here. Just while we're doing that, I'll introduce our two other speakers today. We'll start off the panel with Professor Richard Bedford. I won't mention all his initials that are after that, there's too many of them to mention. He's Emeritus Professor both at University of Waikato and at AUT. Anybody who knows this field knows that he has been sort of the doyen of migration research in New Zealand for a number of decades, and in particular in relation to immigration policy in Asia Pacific. Rachel Simpson, who will speak second, is the Manager for Education, Skills and Immigration at Business New Zealand, and Rachel works on issues related to labour market demand for skilled workers, and I'll be the third participant. So.
Thank you, Arthur. E rā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou. E tika me mihi ki ngā paitahu, nei ngā rangatiri, mihi mai, mihi mai, mihi mai. Ko Richard Bedford tākou ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. These reports are incredibly timely, and I want to commend the Productivity Commission for the significant work that they've been doing on immigration over the last 2 years or so. My interest in migration is, as Arthur said, long-standing, and I spent a lot of time tracking in recent decades what's been happening with what's called the New Zealand Residence Program. The New Zealand Residence Program was the sort of anchor of our so-called permanent migration flows. And that program was clearly struggling in the few years before the pandemic. And in fact, it died in December 2019. It died because the Minister of Immigration at the time, Lise Galloway, decided that we needed a different approach rather than having the residence program essentially fitting within 3 broad streams of flows: skilled and business migrants, parents and families and partners is the second one, and international humanitarian is the third. We should shift to a system that looked more specifically at different visa categories and examined those and made decisions about those, not necessarily within a rigid framework of this share goes to business and skills, this share goes to family, this share goes somewhere else. So the Productivity Commission's work actually comes right at the time when we've got a bit of a vacuum sitting there around how our residence policy sits. Now, not surprisingly, if you read these reports, they are very strongly driven by a productivity lens and by an economic lens. I'm not an economist, I'm a geographer with a background in population studies and migration. So I have a somewhat different lens, and I'm not too sure if the productivity lens on its own really does address the multiple dimensions of well-being. And I've got a few queries around this that I want to to raise. After all, the migrant, from the migrant's perspective, is not just an individual. The migrant is a member of a social unit, a fundamental social unit. Every migrant is a member of a family, and one of the ironies of migration policy all over the world now, it seems, is that when it comes to migration, we can't deal effectively with families. We can really only deal with individuals or the immediate people around that individual. And in fact, migration is a process of creating transnational families. And transnational families are quite complex to live with through time. I'll come back to that in a minute. But Arthur's the expert on wellbeing, so I'm going to let him say a bit more about wellbeing in the context of the way that term is used in the Productivity Commission reports. I just want to note that in the headline report that Ganesh spoke to, there's virtually no reference to family. I think there were 2 pages where I found reference to family explicitly. There are no reference to parents at all. And so I then struggled with the idea that this report is really about our immigration system. It's not about our immigration system. It's, as Ganesh said, it's about our working age population that comes to selected primarily on the basis of what they can contribute to our labour force. It isn't about children, and it isn't about older people. And it's interesting that when the Productivity Commission launched these 2 reports that we're looking at today in their webinar last week, I sat in on the webinar. I was fascinated to watch the chat box, and the chat box just immediately started asking the questions. Well, where's the family? Where's this? Where's that? So I think we need to just keep that in mind. As we look at the key outcome from the report, the key recommendation, and this is how I read the report, which is the government policy statement on immigration. I think this is an excellent idea, and I think it's a major something that the new Minister for Immigration, who's about to arrive in his job just as this report hits his office, needs to be thinking about very, very seriously right from the beginning. Because this government policy statement will have to lay out expectations for the immigration system, not just the working age population. And it will have to do that, as the Productivity Commission recognises, in a range of contexts, including Te Treaty o Waitangi obligations, particularly including assessment of the country's absorptive capacity, and I like that notion, coming with some demographic interests as well as the productivity and wellbeing considerations, which are dealt with very effectively in the report. The other thing is that the statement will be required to be reviewed regularly, and it should be a very significant step in making immigration policy much more transparent to the public, and decisions about immigration policy much more transparent than they are at the moment. Now, the review addresses a lot of issues relating to migration of working age people, and I found that analysis particularly perceptive and comprehensive, especially around economic dimensions of immigration. I was a bit sad that they didn't venture more into the Te Treaty dimension of immigration. I guess showing my longevity a bit. I remember 20 years ago, almost to the day, to be invited to join a immigration advisory group that the Minister of Immigration of the day, Leanne Dalzell, set up in 2002 to help inform government as it formed policy. And the very first question that that advisory group was asked, where is your significant Māori engagement? Where will there be treaty issues examined? Interestingly enough, that advisory group lasted till the next election, which was a very short time after, and it disappeared. But the question about Maori issues and interests in immigration has been around a very long time, and it tends to get pushed out every time. Somebody else has to have a look at it. We don't have the capacity to deal with it. Well, somebody's got to deal with it. And hopefully, as part of the government policy statement, there will be some kind of structure set up to do that. And the Productivity Commission has given some tentative suggestions in the report about how you can get it underway. I've got two other points I want to make. There's a section at the end, section 6, that deals with the Pacific and international, wider international relationships. I was rather surprised that there was no reference in this section to long-established Pacific migration programs, which haven't been abolished, that are very much working age focused. There is a lot of analysis and discussion of the RSE scheme, which is the most recent migration scheme involving the Pacific. And the Commission has sought some new work on this from Motu and from others, and we're looking forward to seeing that published. But there's no reference to the existing quota programs, the Samoan quota or the Pacific Access category. Now, these are critically important in New Zealand's relationship with the Pacific, and even more important now, because as some of you will be very well aware, there's been an absolute revolution in Australian immigration policy relating to the Pacific. It's a revolution which I don't think most New Zealanders have caught up with, but it changes the face of Australia's relationship with the Pacific. And I think we need to be very conscious of this. What they're trying to do is pick up some of the initiatives New Zealand's taken and amend them and modify them. They're going to have quota systems. They're going to have various things in the Pacific. Finally, I return to the Commission's reference to the migration system. I hope the government has or is planning to commission work on visa categories that are explicitly excluded from this analysis. And I'm referring here, obviously, there's the refugee quota, which is written out of the terms of reference for this. But then there's the silent visa categories that are not touched on in this review, which are the ones relating to families, parents, and so on. And the reason I want to see this is that the pandemic and associated restrictions on international population movement have heightened the awareness of the importance of family, both for temporary and long-term residents. As I said earlier, transnational family living has major challenges at any time, but these have been greatly exacerbated by the recent pandemic and border restrictions. The sophisticated analysis of economic dimensions of immigration that's presented in Immigration Fit for the Future needs to be matched with a careful analysis of social and demographic dimensions. And I'm sure there's quite a bit of that in the background papers, and I'll acknowledge I haven't read all those background papers. But I think this is necessary at the same level as what they've done so far to address comprehensively the metaphor that Ganesh draws on from a whakatauki, the metaphor of the nest. And this is dealt with very eloquently in the foreword, and it's returned to in the final paragraph of the report. And I'd like to finish with another whakatauki that provides a metaphor perhaps for the family. It is e tū kahikatia, hei whakapai ururoa, awhi mai, awhi atu, tātou, tātou, hei. It means kahikatia stand together, their roots intertwine, strengthening each other. We all help one another, and together we will be strong. That's not just the individual migrant. That's the migrant, their parents, their family. That's the group. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Motu and Productivity Commission, for inviting me along to talk with these esteemed economists. I'll start by saying I'm not an economist, so I've probably got a little bit of a different take on this, but we've warmly welcomed this report because it's put some science around the immigration policy stuff. Immigration can be a really difficult area to talk about because there is a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of politicization, and we've seen that flow through in various different weird and wonderful ways over the years, and it was good to see that captured in the history of immigration. But I like to think about immigration in the context of opportunity as well, because New Zealand is uniquely placed in terms of being an island at the bottom of the world that is very hard to get to, in terms of being able to use policy and systems as the main way that we monitor those inflows of people. And to build on what Richard has said, that this is a review of the working age population, there is a lot more in that immigration space that we need to think about. So I like to think about the international skills and talent that we attract to New Zealand. And I just note that from when this report was kicked off and the government signalled that they wanted to go through the piece of work looking at employers and firms and the use of immigration, the question was really, how do we dampen down immigration? The question 2 years later now is actually, how do we attract people to New Zealand? So we're very happy with the recommendations that Dr. Nana and his team put together and the findings that migration does not drive down wages and conditions. This has been a long-standing nugget which goes back and forth in a variety of different ways that it's good to see that hasn't borne out, because the contribution that migrants make, not just to New Zealand firms, but also to our communities, is massive, and it should be recognised that is what New Zealand looks like now. Going forward, because we are at this particular junction where the government has proceeded with the visa framework, please go on and get your accreditation if you're in the boat that you need to do that. So we are going to see, hopefully, better data, but I would strongly support the PodCom's recommendation around stronger labour market information and data, and that should be treated as a matter of urgency right now, as well as informing that long-term view, because the reality is that today we have very full planes leaving New Zealand and half full planes coming in, and we don't know whether those are builders and nurses heading ashore for a better life, and we're replacing them with Australian ski bunnies who are here for 2 weeks. We need to be able to make that kind of assessment to be able to take a much more nuanced approach to immigration. So that is something that I think we need to get on top of really quickly, because the last 2 years has provided a bit of an experiment around what does it look like when New Zealand has no immigration. And it's good to see that obviously productivity is a big feature of this, but when we're talking about wellbeing, that skill shortage issue is what's putting the most pressure on businesses. And that's everybody. That's big businesses, that's small businesses. You're lucky to find a company at the moment that will say, we have no problem finding the skills that we need. So further to that, I think we need to think of a new way that we talk about skills. I also agree with the ProdCom's recommendation, although I'll put it a little bit more bluntly, that ANSCO is a dog. It is not fit for a modern labour market and how we talk about jobs and skills in New Zealand, and it's not going to be fit for purpose as industries change, as new jobs come online, to be hooked onto this way of talking about it. And it is particularly grinding that some of that stuff that we call low skilled, actually it doesn't fit into a task framework, but I would challenge anybody here that jobs like in aged care don't require oodles of empathy and social skills that you don't necessarily qualify on a classification framework. So I think there's room there to open up that discussion around what those skills look like, and hopefully this report is going to change that discussion around how we think about immigration in the future.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'll add my thoughts as well. Richard started off by saying he's not an economist, and then he concentrated on exactly the topics that I would be concentrating on as an economist, but also as one with also wearing a hat as Professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University, Wellington. And what really struck me about this inquiry was the very strong emphasis on the link between immigration and productivity, and not on immigration more broadly. That came through very, very strongly. And I'll give you a couple of examples in terms of recommendations. Recommendation 10, that the government speed up processing and increasing the certainty of visa status for highly productive and highly paid workers. Followed by recommendation 11, that Immigration New Zealand should more regularly update the point system. Criteria not found to be strongly associated with good labour market outcomes should be considered for removal or reduced weighting, which is quite an extraordinary sort of statement, it seems to me. Even more, I think the word, well, not sure what word I would use to describe this. It's not pleasant. The government should discontinue the issuance of new permanent resident visas and require new residents to renew their resident visas every 6 years. Now, if you've got a wellbeing focus, can you imagine being a permanent resident in New Zealand, and for whatever reason you haven't become a citizen, and every 6 years you have to renew that residency visa to maintain your permanent residence? My friends are in their 70s, 80s, etc., who are in this category. Can you imagine the well-being, the angst involved for these people as they come up for their 36th anniversary of living in New Zealand and being a permanent resident and being the age of 75 or something, saying, do they still want me? Will I still get my permanent residence? Will they kick me out? Will I be like the 501s? It seems to be trying to out Australia and the Australians. And then you come up to age 81 and you start to lose your marbles. Will they kick me out? And the family will be worried that are you going to be kicked out? I mean, this is perhaps the most heartless recommendation I've seen from a government document or from a government agency in years. And I think it just characterises this whole emphasis of the report, that it's all about productivity and not about families, not about partner visas, family reunification, all these sorts of things, which just are so important in an immigration system. And I think the focus of the report is on productivity is very interesting. It's very good where it goes to, but it's very far too narrow for me in terms of thinking about an immigration system. The emphasis on productivity I've mentioned, and this is a hobby horse of mine, but it's all about physical productivity, not about incomes. When we think about productivity, traditionally in economics, we thought about how many widgets you can get out of so many inputs, but it's actually what's more important is how much income we can get from that, which is quite a different thing. It's partly to do with about the physical productivity, but actually the productivity story that's told here is inaccurate when it comes to incomes per head, which is growing a lot faster. The final point I want to make comes back to the immigration system point that Richard made as well. We can think of net migration made up of three separate components. One is immigration, which we could divide into two, but essentially immigration of New Zealanders and foreign-born people overseas. It's immigration of foreign-born people, and it's immigration of New Zealand-born people who are returning home. And the idea that I think it's too simplistic in this document, that it's easy to target an immigration policy to target net migration flows, steady net migration flows, when we cannot control immigration and we cannot control the immigration of New Zealanders returning home. And the idea that we could actually try and set immigration policies for the foreign-born to maintain a steady flow of net migration is really pie in the sky, because we just cannot control all those New Zealanders that wanted to come home at the start of the pandemic and all those sorts of things. We can't control all the people who want to go to Australia when they dig up yet another mineral that we don't have here and get even richer. I think it's a bit pie in the sky to think that we could have a reasonably stable net migration flow. Having said that, I still support the document that PodCom suggests of a government policy statement on migration. I think the idea of having a long-term focus on migration is something that's been talked about for 20 or 30 years in the circles that I've been in, ever since I was at the Institute of Policy Studies and probably before that. the idea of a long-term immigration or population policy for New Zealand is a sensible one. And so in that respect, I think that's a really sensible recommendation that should be adopted. Okay, well, let's leave it there from the panel, and we're going to open it up now for comments. Or Ganesh and Philip, do you want to actually respond to anything before we open it up for comments?
No, I'm quite happy to leave it for others to have.
Okay.
And thanks for your comments, they're well received.
Okay, we're going to have comments both from the Zoom audience, which Emma is going to translate for us. You can do it from there. We have a little bit of a hum at the back there. Okay, any questions from the audience, especially for Ganesh and Philip? Sorry, no, I'm just saying there's a bit of feedback in terms of the sound man.
Well, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you just shout.
I'm just wondering how you define working age and whether another consideration, because some social considerations have been brought up, is what is happening to the aging of the workforce. The fact that the workforce participation is increasing in terms of age for reasons of longer life and various economic and social reasons. And also the question about skills, because one way of meeting the skill shortages is to make better use of those people in the workforce with considerable experience and skill who are actually probably wanting to stay on in the workforce if they have the conditions to encourage that. And if the general thoughts of the population isn't that you've got to retire at 65. Is that bringing in another element? Is it relevant?
Thanks, Judith. Can the people on Zoom hear that, do you know? We're not sure. Okay, well, let me just repeat. The crux of the question was, how do we define working age people when many older people are now wishing to work? And are there policy implications of that? Ganesh, I'm going to throw that over to you.
You want to do the definition?
Well, I mean, conceptually, the working age population is the age of the people that are working. So in a sense, it ought to take into account that. So I mean, you know, historically determined policy parameters like that from the economist perspective. It's people who have skills that are valuable working particularly because they want to. Many people are returning to the workforce, and they have those, as you say, many skills that the economy ought to value. Some people are working not because they want to, but because of other issues. But that's why the so I would say absolutely. There are people who are working and people who are not working. So and I think as part of that more broader conversation about what are skills and all those sort of things. Economies evolve, societies evolve. The moment you fix it in stone, any kind of definition about who should be in the workplace or who should be or who is in the workplace, I think you're wrong. So again, making sure you're understanding how the labour market and society are working is an important part of any policy, I would argue. Yeah.
Follow-on question?
Yep, follow-on question.
Just to expand on that working age, is that whether it's full-time employee or contractor? It doesn't matter as long as you're being paid for your time.
If I was to be crass and an economist, I would say anything that's a labour input to the production function. So yes, and maybe we won't all work full time in the future. Maybe we'll have a 4-day week or whatever.
But payment.
It's paying in the market.
And non-market as well, Ganesh?
Again,
Taking a wellbeing focus, would you?
Should be, but it's not well. In terms of the immigration inquiry, in the terms of reference, it was working age immigration. It wasn't explicit on that definition. We took it in terms of the data that you've collected in terms of immigration, it's 15 plus. That's the working age definition that economists use. In terms of how you apply it for immigrants, it's the visas with a work right. And as I'm aware, there's no age specification in those visas, but they may be implicit in the admin side. So that's another question.
and I just add to, in a sense, that relates to Arthur's earlier point, is we often look where the light's best. So market transactions are easier to measure, etc. Things like that. Again, they are people coming together to produce value. Is something that, again, I'd hate to think that we were just focusing in one area and we cause something, a lack of something else in society. Kind of means just because we're not measuring it.
And I suppose that's I suppose, responding to that as well as Arthur's comments about well-being. Yes, we did take a productivity lens on it and restricted by data and all of that in terms of market transactions. We did stretch it to well-being, but I have to acknowledge we were restricted when we were not allowed to look at family reunification and those sorts of visas. But also acknowledge that what we found in terms of migrants that made the greatest contribution were those who stayed here longer. And so acknowledge that that recommendation, Ted, that you took issue with, and I hear what you're saying, and maybe that's for us to clarify a bit further, but the intention was to encourage migrants when they come here to make the commitment to stay, rather than use it as a vehicle to kick them out after 6 years.
And on the income one, so I'll put it up. The difference between income and product being about terms of trade. Well, one of the things that I think we do talk about is about the skills that people bring as knowledge of foreign markets and that sort of thing. You would have thought would improve some of the analytical efficiency of some as well. So there's a couple.
I just wanted to clarify one thing with the old residents stream for skilled migrants. There's definitely an age restriction.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Once you reached, I think, 50 or 45, it might have been, you didn't get any points. So there was a definite disincentive to bringing in people in their older ages.
We have a question up here. Yep. Can you shout as much as you can?
Sure, from Victoria University. I just had would be interested in your comments on related to the government policy statement, which I also think is a really great idea. But you did note that there's the long-term versus short-term trade-offs. So I wondered if you had thought about, do these things need to be bipartisan? Are they driven by government of the day? I'm coming from a political science background, because how do you link it with the longer term, the electoral cycles versus the planning cycle? And if I can just add one more question there. The discussion of absorptive capacity, I think, is interesting and valuable from an infrastructure perspective, but of course, internationally, that word absorptive has been used a lot by anti-immigration politicians and political parties in the cultural sense. So I just wondered how you saw that being managed.
Now I've forgotten your first question. Sorry.
Long-term
focus, GPS, that's a bipartisan. Well, in the ideal world, and we acknowledge we don't live in the ideal world, but in an ideal world, yes, immigration. We want to take the politicization of it out of it. And I think that GPS vehicle is a mechanism to minimize that and to encourage that long-term focus and to encourage, I suppose, that bipartisan, well, hopefully encourage a bipartisan perspective on it. And I suppose the way that is operationalized is to not lock in a GPS and say you have to do this, but to actually give us that range. And the transparency comes from the conversations about whereabouts on that range in terms of short-term, long-term we may wish to lie. And through that you get for want of a broad consensus around the range of immigration, or dare I say, and I'm fully with you, Arthur, a population rather than immigration, a population growth, or what you like, range that we are either planning for or comfortable with over the long term, rather than every spot year as a target. In terms of absorptive capacity, yes, there's a bit about the vocabulary there, and that's why I stressed in terms of our perspective on absorptive capacity. It's more than just the bricks and mortar. It's that community infrastructure and the community understanding and indeed acceptance of migrants, and that, like any capacity, requires investment. And so we as a community, are we prepared to do that activity, whether it's the investment in migrant settlement programs, or whether it's the investment in the communities themselves, to encourage them to see the benefits of the diversity that migrants bring, not just in productivity terms, but also in well-being terms. So yes, there's a conversation to be had about let's broaden that definition of absorptive capacity. And it's definitely why we will obviously steered away from words about wanting to assimilate migrants or something like that. All those other nasty words that we could use.
And it is something, I mean, there already is information collected on attitudes towards migrants and attitudes of migrants to how they're received. And they, you know, at the moment, they seem to be generally kind of positive. So again, that's part of that.
World Wellbeing Report 2 years ago had a thing on attitudes to migrants, and New Zealand and Finland were the two top countries in terms of welcoming migrants.
Good migrants as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Emma, you've got some people from Zoom.
Yes. And they have been saying that they can hear the questions from the audience, which is
But you can shout out as well.
okay. So first off, would it be useful to look at potential contribution from a postdoctoral scheme for the migrants on productivity? Could be a cheaper and effective way to explore niche areas.
Quite a specialist view here, quite a specialist question. Any thoughts on postdocs?
Yeah, more the merrier.
I think there's a little bit of work, I just can't remember exactly how it ended up, but we've got some other papers that we've got coming out soon. So Hilary Devine did some work looking at pathways of migrants as they come into the country and where do they go, particularly from the labour market focus. And so that was, I think, the bit I can remember was more broadly about graduates and how few of them remain. But I think, you know, clearly for doctorates it's a very different kind of thing. But if you think about it, many of the things that you you know, skills about understanding social constructs and operating in New Zealand, they'll have learned many of those things already by being here. And the fact they're doing a doctorate here suggests at least one person is interested in what they're doing. So there might be a matching there. You know. At least at work at the beginning.
So, yeah, I'm going to swap between people in the audience and people on Zoom. So up here next.
Thanks, Ganesh and for your outline of what you found and for the feedback from Richard and others. I remember some work that Economic Labour did some 10 or 12 years ago, the economic impact of migration, looking at what skills we needed on this. So I guess we are revisiting some of those things wider than that. One of the things that I used to ask is, New Zealand does New Zealand have a population policy? And the answer was, we have an immigration policy, answers are population questions. So this comes to the focus on working age population. And working age population for New Zealand, my understanding is that anybody over 15 with no cutoff at the other end. There are countries which have got a cutoff of 65, which is not the case, strictly speaking, in itself. So anybody who wants to work in paid work, I suppose, but not paid work, the thing to consider. So my question to Ganesh in particular is about this make and buy things that we have talked for a while. The short-term solution, the medium-term solution, and the long-term solution. It's been passing the short-term solution to a medium-term and then to a long-term. This thing about buying rather than making. What's different now? Whether the situation in New Zealand and the
oh yes, I do. I do.
For making more than buying, because we are competing with other countries for buying, and not necessarily we are in a better position to buy skills. So
I would, without getting too gloomy and pessimistic, I would say that we, as a nation, have opted for the short-term solutions relatively more than long-term, and I would say that's not limited to skill development. I know I can broaden it to other things. And in particular, the last 10 years has tilted the playing field even more towards it with the use of temporary migrants. And I think what we've got within the structures of our migration system are incentives that assist that short-term behaviour. So when there's a skill, when a firm faces a skill shortage, there is an incentive to scramble and lobby and get your occupation on a skill shortage list, rather than do the think about, okay, is that person actually really valuable to me, or can I bring in alternative labour, or can I actually invest in building a workforce for the future, or do I go a different way in terms of different production methods, in terms of different technology and all that. The mechanisms we've got at the moment tilt to that decision in the Prodcom's decision way too much to that short term. And so what we're asking for, what we're recommending is tilting that playing field a little bit more to evenly, so that when the firm faces that decision, they face wage pressures, yes, and that brings that longer term option a bit more into balance.
Rachel, did you have a thought on that?
Yes, of course I do. Yeah, I think one of the bits in the Protocol report that we'll want to pick up on is that relationship between the skills development, the migration, and also our benefit system, because those are the three main sources of labour market supply in New Zealand, and we don't necessarily have alignment across those three things. So when we're talking about skills, and this kind of touches on your first question at the start, one of the main constraints on our ability to train in the workplace is actually the lack of senior people there to be able to bring those apprentices or graduates or whatever that looks like through. So there is a whole ecosystem that sits around us. There's a lot of work to be done to get that stuff working, because if you think about, for example, those that are on the unemployment benefit at the moment, there's other types of social interventions that are needed to be able to get those people into employment, rather than the lack of jobs available at the moment. And one of the things that the report doesn't mention is we have a massive skills mismatch in New Zealand in our labour market. So we've had massive growth in apprentices over the last couple of years, with various incentives that have been put in place. But a lot of those people already have university degrees. They end up finding they don't like working in an office, and they go and find that their true passion is being a builder or whatever it looks like for that person. So when we're talking about the system and you start extrapolating out, how do we actually train more people? How do you create those right incentives in the workforce? And at the moment, obviously, scarcity is driving up wages, but the reality is there's more jobs being advertised and less people applying for jobs. So there's a bunch of stuff in the labour market that we're going to have to make incremental fixes to across education policy. And I think that's one of the things where Dr. Nana identified that immigration can have adverse effects on some communities. I would probably argue that it's in favour of our education system in a large part.
Emma, another one from Zoom.
Yes.
Nice loud.
I note a significant issue about the cancellation of permanent resident visas. As a licensed immigration advisor, I can see the permanent resident visa contributes a great deal in attracting global talent, the group of people you consider high skilled. I believe the policymakers have enough wisdom to manage the inflows of New Zealanders from overseas in case of war, climate change, etc., rather than banning people from getting permanent residency. We should work on how to retain permanent residents and New Zealand citizens, such as upgrade our markets, bringing more people to stimulate the economy, and allow New Zealanders to reunite with their offshore parents, give parents residency to keep New Zealanders in New Zealand. Will there be public hearings if the government decides to make significant changes to the policies, such as cancelling the permanent resident visa?
I'm not sure if that's a question.
The last question I can answer quite openly. We have no idea what the government is going to do. We're waiting on the government's response to our recommendations, which will be public when they issue that response, which will be usually in the next 2 or 3 months. Again, I just reiterate that permanent residence, that recommendation in the first instance was driven by the observation that we are actually an outlier in terms of international practice, in terms of having a permanent resident visa that's not required to be renewed over a period of time. So that was the first, I think, that we observed. And the second thing was recognising that the longer a person stays, the better they are in terms of contributing to productivity and well-being. And so it was a mechanism to encourage settlement for the long term, or commitment for the long term. And that was effectively to encourage them to make a decision to be a citizen. Now, acknowledge there are some other matters that need to be taken on board on that. So that's in the points that the questioner makes there is that we need to consider.
So I think it's quite interesting to think about your point about the permanent versus citizenship, about this concept. So I became a citizen because I wanted to stay. I'm interested to know what those reasons are that you might choose to continue to be a permanent, not be a citizen, that kind of thing.
Anyway, that's personal choice of those people at the moment.
Well,
There was a question up here somewhere, I think, yeah, at the back, yeah.
I almost got the impression that this is on the productivity commission and read through different reports, and you talk about the kind of quote unquote low skill area. I got from the productivity commission kind of concern about those lower skill migrant areas being less contributive to productivity, whereas I heard from you hearing about how saying that this kind of area is the whole idea of that express wages. So I was wondering if someone could try, you know, is there a difference in there, or is that just different? Yeah.
So I don't think we are necessarily out of shape. In fact, we're probably closer on this issue than we have been over the last. There's been a series of reports that have come through from the Productivity Commission, and we've had the chance to engage pretty regularly with them. There's a lot of shorthand around the immigration stuff, which is low wages, low skill. Now, the really big problem with that is that it's where a lot of labour market demand in New Zealand is. And we've seen that, particularly over the last couple of years, when you've looked at how our critical workers have been as part of the COVID response. And it is a large proportion of people in those areas. And we also have different spreads around how much industries use immigration to be able to fill those skill shortages. And we're seeing really significant impacts of having no immigration coming through for the last couple of years. To be honest, without our migrant communities, the country wouldn't have operated for the last 2 years under these communities, under these conditions. So yes, we want wages to go up, but we want that to come through from increased productivity. That is what drives wages up in our view, not restricting immigration. And I think that's where the problem landed on this.
I think that's fair. I mean, there is that question about low skill, high skill, and we worry about that terminology, obviously, and it is seen by many as a proxy for worth or value, and also that comes into the latest, I suppose, the latest policy decision around the wage threshold, that we, in terms of temporary migrants, you're allowed, you can bring in migrants above that as long as you're paying above a certain wage. We see that as a fairly blunt tool, or as a very blunt tool. In particular, if you see the wage threshold, it's discriminatory, because if we've got gender wage gap, then obviously the wage threshold enables more male migrants rather than female. So it's discriminatory on that ground. But it's also blunt in the sense that it encourages, again, the existing lobbying behaviour for the carve-outs, because of migrants who are not paid at that above that wage threshold, but that we still, for want of a better word, need in the country. And the best example is aged care workers. And we can talk about the long term and the short term about that, but in terms of aged care workers who are not paid above that wage threshold, we have to argue about can we lobby to get them in a carve out so we can bring them in. They don't meet the wage threshold, but we still need to bring them in. And it just is not a robust way of doing policy decision making. So that's why we suggest a range of other tools should be looked at rather than the blunt wage threshold.
Okay, now I'm just going to go for two very quick questions, because we've got one. I want a very quick question from Emma, and we've got a quick question from up here. Both of them quick, and we'll take them two together.
So one more from the Zoom chat, and apologies to all the other Zoomers who have some questions in. So from Eric Crampton, if migrants are really neither here nor there for affecting productivity or for affecting wages, wouldn't that suggest moves away from targeting migration to specific industrial areas and toward more broad-based acceptance of migration?
And can I have this other question as well with that too?
No, I was just in response to Rachel, you talked about there's that development that there have been negative effects on certain groups such as low experience, low skill youth, split into that, Māori and Pacifica, and actually referred to a failure of the education system. But I wonder if employers' perceptions of their responsibility for training and pastoral care have changed due to the steady tap of immigration that they've had over recent years.
Yeah, I'd dispute that. I don't actually think that employers necessarily do look to immigration as the first port of call, because it is more expensive, it is more unreliable, and the lack of certainty around whether you're going to be able to keep that worker is actually a really big disincentive. Now, the training system is going through massive reforms at the moment, we really got to try and get this stuff right. And there are some green shoots in there, but like I said, we've seen really big uptake in apprenticeships. And kind of emphasise why it's important to look across not just the immigration settings, because it doesn't sit in a silo. It does have to sit alongside what we do in education and training, and what we do as social interventions around particularly long-term unemployed.
And on Eric's point,
you know, yes, immigration's neither here nor there in terms of wages and employment, but that's at the moment, that backs up our recommendation to put immigration, see immigration alongside all those other policy decisions that we need to make around absorptive capacity, around workforce education. We get all of those right alongside immigration, there's a potential to get even more out of our more impact from the migrants that do come in, not to mention all of us.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a very nice way to finish. So I want to thank all our speakers today, Rachel and Richard and Philip and Ganesh. Fascinating topic, fascinating report. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly encourage you to read it. It's very, very interesting and got a wealth of information in it. So thank you to everyone for coming along and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsors for making this possible to put it on, and we'll welcome you at the next public policy seminar. So with these masks here, that would have been possible.